The sale of my home stopped feeling routine the moment someone reviewing the file said, "I'm seeing your name on another property." That was the line. Not the value of my house. Not the repairs I had made. Not how long I had lived there. Not any of the ordinary things a homeowner expects to hear when preparing to sell a primary residence after years of living in it. Another property. More specifically, 1% of another property. Until that moment, I had been moving through the sale the way most people do. I was thinking about timing, packing, proceeds, and what comes after. I was not expecting a technical ownership detail from years earlier to become the center of the conversation. But once it surfaced, the tone changed immediately. My house was no longer being viewed as a simple primary residence sale. Now there was an ownership complication attached to my name, and everyone involved wanted to understand exactly what it meant. I said, "It's only 1%. I said it automatically, the way people downplay something they have spent years treating as harmless. The woman on the call did not argue with me. She just said, "You should have your tax advisor review that in connection with the sale." That was enough. No one told me I had definitely lost the capital gains exclusion on my home. No one said I was facing an automatic tax disaster. But the issue had been flagged, and once an issue like that gets flagged in a home sale, your mind moves fast. My first thought was not technical. My first thought was much simpler. Why is this coming back now? The answer was obvious, and that was the part one did not like. It was coming back because the ownership had always been real. I had just spent years treating it like it wasn't. When my son bought his house, he needed help getting the mortgage approved. That is how it was presented to me at the time. The numbers were tight, underwriting was strict, and he needed a little more strength in the file. He did not ask me to take over the purchase. He did not ask me to move in. He did not frame it as a major financial entanglement. He asked me to go on as a 1% owner. 1%. It sounded tiny, technical, almost symbolic. That was the mistake. Anything that places your name on a deed is not symbolic. At the time, I asked what most parents would ask. Am I actually taking on this house? And I got the kind of answer that calms people instead of educating them. It was described as paperwork, a formality, something that would help the approval go through, but would not really affect my life. I was told I would not be living there. I was told it was minor. The emotional framing was clear. This was one of those ordinary family assists that makes a difficult market slightly more manageable for the next generation. I believed that because I wanted to believe it. That is how a lot of family risk gets accepted. Not because someone sits you down and lies in a dramatic way, but because everyone involved agrees to speak about a real obligation in softened language until it stops sounding dangerous. If someone had told me then, "This may not create an immediate problem, but it is real ownership and it may later trigger tax review, lender questions, or documentation problems when you sell your own house," I would have treated the arrangement very differently. I still might have helped him, but I would not have treated it like a harmless favor. I would have treated it like what it was, a legal position with future consequences. I called my son as soon as I got off that first review call. I expected concern. At minimum, I expected him to understand why the issue mattered now that my own home was being sold. Instead, he responded the same way I had. "It's only 1%. That phrase sounded very different coming from him. When I said it, I was trying to calm myself. When he said it, it sounded like he wanted the whole thing pushed back down into the category of family inconvenience. Something emotional. Something I was maybe overthinking. I told him exactly what had been said to me. I told him the issue had been raised and that I was being advised to review it with a tax professional. He kept minimizing it. He said it should be fine. He said lots of people do this for family. He said I was probably worrying too much. That was the first point where my frustration stopped being general and became personal. Not because I thought he meant to put me in this position. I don't think that. But intention was no longer the main issue. My sale was now under a level of review I had not expected, and the person who benefited from the arrangement was treating that stress like a personality problem instead of a real financial concern. So I asked him a direct question. "When you asked me to do this, Did anyone ever explain to you how it could affect me later? There was a pause, and then he said, I assumed it wouldn't. That answer bothered me more than if he had argued. Because assumptions are cheap when someone else is carrying the risk. That same day, I started making calls. I wanted one thing above all: a clean answer. Instead, what I got was something more realistic. Owning 1% of another property does not automatically disqualify someone from the home sale capital gains exclusion on their primary residence. That mattered. It was an important distinction. The law does not simply say, you own something else, therefore you lose the exclusion. But that was only the first half of the conversation. The second half was the part that changes how you sleep. The presence of another ownership interest, even a small one, can trigger closer scrutiny. It makes timing matter more. It makes documentation matter more. It makes sloppy facts more dangerous. If I had moved out and delayed my sale too long, that mattered. If I had converted the home into a rental before selling, that mattered. If the transaction dragged across tax years and disrupted other planning, that mattered. The 1% stake did not invent new tax law, but it made my margin for error smaller. That was enough to turn a straightforward sale into something that required active management. I did not like that at all. The more I understood, the more offended I became by the way the original arrangement had been framed. The issue was no longer, will I definitely lose the exclusion? The issue was that I had agreed to something real under language designed to make it sound unreal. And that difference matters more and more the older you get, because at a certain stage of life your house is not just an address. It is equity. It is timing. It is tax planning. It is retirement flexibility. It is the difference between a smooth transition and a costly mess. That is why even a maybe becomes serious. A few days later, a second layer surfaced. I was also speaking to people about my own next step, and it became clear that the 1% stake could raise questions there as well. Once your name appears on another mortgage property, underwriters may want to know whether you carry any exposure connected to that debt. They may want proof of who has actually been making the payments. They may want records. In other words, the issue was not limited to the home I was selling. It had the potential to follow me into whatever came next. That was the moment I stopped treating this as a stressful surprise and started treating it as a file. A real file. I asked my son for the documents I needed. Deed records, mortgage statements, dates, anything that showed when my name had been added, how the ownership was structured, and who had actually been making the payments. I did not ask emotionally. I asked clearly. He was slower than he should have been. Not openly refusing. Just not moving with any urgency. A document here, a partial answer there, and then silence. At one point, I got a message saying he had been busy. Busy. There are certain words that become insulting only because of context. If this had been an ordinary household chore, busy would have been fine. But I was in the middle of a home sale with tax and lender review touching a favor I had done for him, and I was getting busy as the explanation for missing records. That changed the tone of my response. I sent him a written list of exactly what I needed, exactly why I needed it, and exactly how delay could create problems on my end. I did not dress it up. I did not soften it. I did not turn it into a family conversation. I treated it like what it had become, a matter tied to my sale, my taxes, and my financial planning. Then I added the sentence that finally got his attention. I told him that any legal, tax, title, or financing costs caused by my 1% ownership interest would be his responsibility going forward. He called almost immediately. That told me everything I needed to know about how the arrangement had been operating. For days, my concern had been treated as overreaction. The moment consequences began moving back toward him, the matter became urgent. He said, "You're making it sound like I used you." I said, "I'm saying I agreed to a real ownership position that was presented to me as small and harmless, and now it is affecting my sale. So no, I'm not going to be the only one paying for that." He said he never asked me to pay any professional fees. I told him, "You also never asked me to worry about losing time, dealing with extra review, or defending my own home sale because my name is on your property." But that's where this ended up. That was the first truly adult conversation we had about it. Not because it was warm, because it was specific. That is what families often avoid when money and property get mixed together. Specificity. Everyone wants the emotional comfort of family and the legal effect of paperwork, but once something goes wrong, the law does not care who meant well. It cares whose name is where, what was signed, what can be documented, and who carries the exposure. Once I shifted into that mindset, I started feeling calmer. Not because the issue disappeared, but because I was no longer trying to emotionally manage a technical problem. I was gathering facts, organizing dates, pulling records, and getting clear answers. The more complete the file became, the smaller the panic got. That did not mean the issue was imaginary. It meant uncertainty was no longer allowed to dominate the entire situation. And uncertainty was a major part of the damage. That is something people underestimate when they talk about these arrangements. They focus on the worst-case tax bill or the biggest possible legal consequence. Sometimes the real damage is earlier and quieter than that. It is the time, the loss of peace, the professional review, the delay, the sudden need to defend facts that never should have been left vague. The sale that should have been procedural now feels like it requires a small audit of your past family decisions. That is not free. Even when the worst case does not happen, it is still not free. Eventually, after several careful conversations, I got the answer I needed most. The 1% ownership interest did not automatically destroy my ability to claim the exclusion on my own home. That was a relief. A real one. My sale had not turned into the immediate tax disaster I feared during those first days. But relief is not the same thing as innocence. The arrangement was still reckless. The exposure was still real. The stress was still unnecessary. And I could not shake the fact that all of it had been preventable if the original favor had been handled with the seriousness it deserved. If I had insisted on written terms. If I had required an exit path from the beginning. If I had made it clear that temporary support meant exactly that. If I had refused to let family help stand in for actual planning. That is the part one kept coming back to. The issue was not that I loved my son too much. The issue was that I had let love do the work that structure should have done. And once property is involved, structure matters more than sentiment. So I made one final shift. I stopped thinking of this as an old favor that had become inconvenient. I started thinking of it as an ownership exposure that needed to end. I sent my son a formal written notice. No speech, no accusations, no family therapy language, just the facts. I stated that I had agreed to a 1% ownership interest solely to assist with his mortgage approval. I stated that the arrangement had now materially complicated the review of my own home sale and required additional tax and financing analysis. I stated that I would not sign any further property-related documents, extend any additional ownership accommodation, or absorb any professional costs tied to that interest. I stated that he needed to begin the proper lender-approved process for removing my name from the arrangement as soon as realistically possible. That was the line. Not emotional distance. Structural distance. He called again, this time angry. He said I was making him feel like a legal problem. I told him this became a legal and financial problem the second my house stopped being a simple sale because my name was on your property. He said families are supposed to help each other. I said, help is not the same thing as indefinite exposure. That ended the real argument. Because underneath all the emotion, that had always been the issue. Not whether I should have helped. Not whether he meant harm. Not whether parents support adult children. The issue was whether my willingness to help once meant I had to remain indefinitely available as a technical owner, a paperwork complication, and a backup financial shield inside his housing situation. The answer was no. That answer should have been built into the deal on day one. Instead, I had to create it years later, in the middle of my own sale. The irony of the whole situation is that the final damage was not the giant tax catastrophe I feared at the beginning. The final damage was more adult than that, which is often how these things go. It was stress, delay, professional review, forced lesson, The loss of the easy belief that small numbers mean small consequences. 1% sounded trivial in the family conversation. It did not look trivial on title records. It did not feel trivial when tied to a sale, a lender, and a tax advisor. And once you live through that, you stop using soft language for hard obligations. I completed the sale with more caution than I had expected and less innocence than I had started with. I still love my son. That never changed. But love is not a tax strategy. It is not a lender guideline. It is not a title solution. And it is not enough by itself to justify letting your name stay attached to real estate you do not control. What changed in me was simpler than anger. I got precise. Never again will I allow a property favor to live in the category of just paperwork. If my name goes on a deed, the terms go in writing. If the risk can flow back to me later, the exit path exists from day one. If someone tells me it is only 1%, I will hear the sentence the right way the first time. It is still ownership. It is still exposure. And until my name is off it, it is still my problem.